Welcome to part 28 in this series of videos showing how to create a simple purchase order system using Blazor and C#. In this video, we'll look at saving an order with commit and rollback. In a previous video, part 13 I think it was, I pointed out that the method I used to save the order was not best practice. The reason for this is that the order header and order lines were saved in separate procedures, and should the insert of an order line fail in any way, we would have incomplete data. Perhaps an order header with no lines, or with only some of the lines. At the time, I excused this shortcoming on the grounds that doing it properly looked complicated, and for expediency, I chose to ignore the problem. In hindsight, ignoring the problem was definitely the right thing to do. Solving this problem has been a voyage of discovery, and I'm still not convinced I've found the right answer. But I have enjoyed the challenge, and it has been challenging. So let's have a look at the code. Before we start tearing our current code apart, it's worth reminding ourselves how we are saving a new purchase order. The code for saving a new purchase order is shown here, and the first thing we do is check that it is a new order by checking that PO header ID is 0. Then we post the purchase order header, and that uses the PO header service, PO header insert. Then we cycle round the individual purchase order lines in the order lines collection, and for each one we post using the PO line service, PO line insert. So we've got two distinct things happening here. We've got the purchase order header and the purchase order lines. And if we want to wrap those all in one transaction, we've got a number of different things we need to deal with. First of all, we'll deal with the fact that at the moment we're cycling around here for every purchase order line, each time attempting to insert a line. And then we've got to deal with the fact that these are using two separate services, PO header service and PO line service. That's the challenge. Now, the first thing that we want to tackle is this section here on posting each of the purchase order lines separately. And the way we can tackle that is by using something called a data table. A data table can be thought of as an in-memory table similar to a SQL table. I'll put the link to the Microsoft documentation in the description, and by chance it just happens to use order header and order detail as the example, but it's very comprehensive and we'll be taking a far more simple approach. In essence, the steps needed to create and populate a data table is first of all to add an using system.data statement at the top of the page. So we'll do that straight away. That allows us to use system.data and therefore data table. And then in our routine to save an order process, the first thing we need to do is to create the data table. I've already got some code for this, and what I'm going to do is just comment out that section and bring in the new code, and I'll try and explain it. So the first thing we do is define the data table, and we're going to call it order lines data table. And then we have to add the columns for that table. So we go through each of the columns that we want, and this mirrors exactly the SQL table PO lines, including the data types or near representations of them. And then what we do is go through the order lines, defining a new data row and then adding the values for each of the row. So PO line, header ID, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we add the new data row. So that's created the data table. With the data table populated, we can now just pass the data table object to the posting routine. Now we're going to, as I suggested earlier, we've got two services in existence already. We've got PO header service and PO line service. And if we're going to wrap the whole of the posting of a new purchase order into a single transaction, we're going to have to either include the lines in the PO header service or the header in the PO line service, or the third option, which I'm going to take, which is to create a new service altogether. So I'm going to go to data and create a new file. And I'm going to call it purchase order service. I'm now going to delete all that code and bring in some that I've already got. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new class called purchase order service. I'll create the interface in a minute. This bit, the database connection down here, that's exactly as we've used before. But now we've got the PO insert, and I'm going to use PO insert eventually for PO header and PO lines. But at the moment, I'm passing into it the data table, the order lines data table that we've just created. And then what I'm going to do is for each data row in order lines data table, I'm going to run through or cycle through those, and I'm going to then use the existing purchase order line insert stored procedure to insert them. So in fact, I'll still be inserting them separately, but I'm passing the data table to this purchase order service as a single item. Having created that, we need to add the interface. So I'll create a new file. I'll call it purchase order service. And for simplicity again, I'm just going to bring the code in. So there's nothing extraordinary there. We also need to register the service in startup. And just bear this in mind, because that's easily forgotten, and I forgot it when I initially tried this and couldn't understand why it wouldn't work. Then back on the purchase order page, we need to inject that new service. So we're injecting purchase order service, and then finally in here we need to call that, and we can just do that. So we're just having success equals await purchase order service, purchase order insert, and then we're passing into the data table. At this stage, we should be able to save the code and run it. So the system runs, which is always a good thing. I've cleared out all the existing data just so what I'm doing in this video becomes a little bit clearer. So we'll add an order. So that seems to be working fine. So we'll go back to the code. And what I should have mentioned is that we're still using the header ID that we're getting when we're posting the PO header, and we're populating the rows on the individual order lines table with that header ID. So the next task is to combine the order header and order lines into a single method or service. And the revelation that came to me at this stage, after doing quite a lot of digging around, was that it's possible to pass multiple parameters to a service relating to different objects. In other words, it's possible to pass header and line information to the same service at the same time. And we're going to use that ability here. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this information here. Instead of passing it to the PO header service, we're now going to copy that and pass it to the purchase order service. And put a comma in there. I'll try and make that look a little bit neater. And we can now comment out this section because we won't need it. So now we're passing to the purchase order service PO insert all the information about the PO header as well as the order lines. So we need to make some changes to the purchase order services. And in here, we're going to need to pass in the information about the purchase order header as well. I think I've already got some code that will do this for us. And I can see there's a problem there. And I'm pretty sure it's because we haven't got using system up at the top. Right, so date time is now. Okay. So we're now passing into the, let's get rid of that as well to save confusion. We're now passing in the purchase order header and order lines information, but we need to make a similar change to the interface. So I'll copy that and paste it in here. Now back in here, we need to add the code that's going to be inserting the purchase order header as well as the order lines. And we're going to be getting the header ID in this section now because we've commented out this bit here where we were getting the header ID. So on purchase order service, we need the header ID. And so what we'll do is we'll just declare a variable called new header ID. And in here, we'll insert the code for posting the purchase order header. So what we're doing here is we're declaring some parameters, header parameters. I've called it header parameters, and we're populating them with the information we've got coming in, being passed to the method, and we're running the same stored procedure to get the data, and we're then assigning the value new header ID from the header parameters get dynamic parameter that we used earlier. So that all looks good. We need to make one more change in here, in that we want to put in the a new header ID in place of here. So actually the easiest way to do this, if I just copy that and replace this, we should get that working. In here, we don't need that row, so we can comment that out. And with that, we should be able to run the application. Let's just save it and run it. Let's add another order. Save it. And that's working correctly as well. So far, so good. So just to reiterate what we've just done, we're now we're creating a data table of the order lines, and then we're passing into our purchase order service, PO insert, the order header information and the order lines data table. In the purchase order service, we're now receiving those parameters. We're using the header information to post the header and get the header ID, and then we're going through each of the individual purchase order lines, populating it with the new header ID, and then inserting those into the SQL table. But the problem remains, we've now got this working all in one service, but we've still got separate inserts for the header and lines. So if there's a failure in any of these lines, for example, then we'll be having the header information there and maybe some, but not all, of the order lines. And now's the time to wrap all these into a single transaction. And because it's going to be quite complicated to see on here, I've actually got a file set up so we can show you the format. So the format is, forget the squiggly lines, this is not real code. Immediately after doing the PO insert, I'm going to create a Boolean called posted successfully. Then it uses the connection that we've established already. We open the connection, and then we have this statement that says using var trans equals con begin transaction. So we're creating a variable called trans, and we're going to begin the transaction. And then we have a try catch section. So the try, we're going to do something and then do something else. So what we're going to be doing here is posting the purchase order header, and then we're going to be posting the purchase order lines. If those complete successfully, we're going to commit the transaction, and we're going to set the posted successfully variable to true. If any of this goes wrong, the catch will catch it, and we're going to roll back the transaction, and the posted successfully will be set to false. So we're then going to return, in either case, posted successfully, true or false. So that's the general format of the way we're going to do this. So I'm just going to comment that out again and go back to purchase order service. And to avoid me making a mess of typing this all out, I've got it prepared. So I'll just delete that and bring in the code I've already got. So this is exactly as we've had before. No, it isn't. I'm declaring that twice. I don't want that. And yeah, that looks okay. Let me just sort this out. Right, so following the pattern, we're declaring the new header ID, declaring the Boolean posted successfully, we're declaring the connection and we're opening the connection, and then we're going to begin the transaction. We're going to try inserting the PO header, same as before. Then we're going to try and insert the PO lines exactly as before. If all that works, we're going to commit it, and we're going to be changing posted successfully to true. Otherwise, we're going to roll back the transaction and set posted successfully to false, and then going to return posted successfully. Either way, back to purchase order page. All that remains for now is to alert the user that the saving of the purchase order failed if an error occurred. So if we go back to purchase order page, luckily we've already got a warning component in place that we're using for various other things, and we can simply call that with the appropriate wording. And we can do that under here. So if success by the way is the Boolean here. So although these are different variable names, it's called success here, and it was posted successfully on the other on the purchase order service. So if success is false, we're going to issue a warning, and it's going to say order was not saved, and then we're going to open the dialog. In all cases, I want to clear this table of order lines table data. So we should now test it again. I'll add another order. And it saved it correctly, as we would expect. What is more interesting is if we try and force an error. And if we go to purchase order service, we can probably force an error by changing, say, PO line tax ID to be PO tax IXD, for example. And what I want to do now is I want to put a breakpoint in here. So let's run it again. I'll add another order. And this time, when I save it, first of all, we'll hit a breakpoint, but then it should fail. So if I click save, and it's hit the breakpoint, if I hover over here, we'll see that new header ID is equal to 4. So we'll just recall that or remember that. And now I'm going to tell the system to continue. And as we expected, we get warning, order was not saved. So I click OK. And the user can carry on clicking save as many times as they like. It's not going to get saved. So I'll cancel that and go back to the code and stop it. If you remember, that ID was 4. If we now look in SQL and look in header ID, PO header, and select, oh, doesn't matter, we'll edit the top 200 rows. We'll see we've only got 3. And if we look in the PO lines, we've got about 6, but 3 is the last one we had there. Now, if we go back to the code, I correct that, and we run it again, and I add another order. and save it, it works. But intriguingly, see that we've skipped order numbers here. In fact, we've skipped 4 and 5. I think that's probably because I tried saving it twice. That's taken me a little bit by surprise, but it was because we tried saving it twice. If we now look in SQL and look at the PO header, we'll see we've now jumped to PO header 6. So 4 and 5 have been omitted because we tried to attempt to save it and it didn't save it. And if we look in PO lines, we can see that we haven't got anything in there for 4 or 5. So we are catching the errors. I think in practice, of course, this is going to be pretty unlikely to happen anyway, but we are trapping the error and not allowing incomplete data to get posted to the database. So we've done what we've achieved, what we set out to achieve. Either the whole order is saved or the whole order is rejected, and we won't get the situation where an order is part saved. However, while researching this, I discovered that as well as being able to pass the order lines as a single object to the PO insert service, it is also possible to pass a data set to SQL as a single object. And this seemed too good an opportunity to let pass without covering that. To do this, we need to follow the following steps. In SQL, we need to create a type that matches exactly the structure of the table that we want to insert multiple rows to. This is known as a user-defined type, or UDT. So let's have a look in SQL. In SQL, we've got our tables, but under programmability, we've got types, and we're going to be creating a user-defined table type. We've got nothing there at the moment. So I've got some code ready. So order lines UDT. So this is the SQL that's required for that. So it says create type order lines UDT. UDT seems to be a common method of just identifying them. And this here is exactly the same as the ordinary table. So I'll run that and that'll create the type. And then we want to create a stored procedure for the insert that reads from the UDT that we've just created. So if I go to programmability, it doesn't make any difference where I do it, but under stored procedures, I'll open our insert set stored procedure, and that's going to say we're going to call it PO line insert set because we're inserting a set of data. It's taking a parameter called order lines of type order lines UDT, and it's going to begin and insert, and we're going to select from the order lines variable or parameter that we're passing in. So let me execute that. So that's the SQL setup. And in our code, I've just remembered there's one vital thing to do with this beginning and then the committing of transactions. We've created this variable called trans, and what I omitted to mention was that on the stored procedure line, we've got to have transaction : trans on the end. Apologies if you've tried this and found you had an error because I failed to tell you that. So what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be replacing this section where we're posting each individual line separately with that new SQL stored procedure where we're going to be passing in the data set. But there's, as always, a catch. we need to update each row in order lines data table with the header ID. So let's do that. And the code for that is this. So we've now got the new header ID, and then we're going to update PO line header ID for the PO lines data table. So we're going to cycle through each row in order lines data table, and we're just going to set that value to new header ID. And lastly, we're going to not need this. So I'm going to comment that out and put in the code that I think we do need, which is this. So we're creating an anonymous object called line parameters, and we're setting order lines, which is the PO line insert set. So that was the name of the parameter being passed in. So it's the order lines data table as table valued parameter, and order lines UDT is the type. And then we execute the new stored procedure with, of course, the transaction : trans at the end. So all that remains is to save everything and one final test. So let's add one more order. I'm going to choose a different supplier this time. Let's save it. Hooray, it's saved. So now we've got all the orders being posted with no chance of an order line going missing or some incomplete set of data happening. The funny thing is once it's completed, it looks fairly straightforward. But getting all the pieces of this jigsaw to fit together was quite a struggle at times. Ultimately, though, it's been hugely rewarding to have it working. Of course, we still haven't completed everything we could do. If I go back to the purchase order page, all we've tackled so far is if the PO header ID is 0, i.e. we've got a new purchase order. Yet to be tackled is if an order is being edited. I'm sure that will follow exactly the same kind of pattern that we've used up here. And if I put my mind to it, I'll probably not make a video on it unless it looks particularly interesting, but I will post the code up on the Blazor code website. One other thing of note, in our previous video, or one of the previous videos, we showed how to deploy the application to Azure. If you're going to republish this to Azure, I think you can just choose republish in the way that we did previously. However, the SQL will need to be amended manually. So you'll need to go to SQL Management Studio. I'll close that and close purchase orders. You'll need to connect to the Azure SQL database. And with that in place, you should then select that database, and you should then be able to select the UDT, because we aren't purchase orders. We should be able to just select that and execute it, and it will then run on the SQL Server on Azure. So that's that one done. And we'll also need to do the stored procedure, execute that as well. And if we now refresh this and look at the purchase order database, and if we just look at programmability and look at types, for example, user-defined table types, we've got the orders line UDT. So you'll need to do that in SQL before publishing. As always, I've got this documented on the blazorcode.uk website. Have a look in there if you need to look at it at leisure. I'll put the code on there as well. If you've got any comments, please leave them in the comments section to the video. And thank you very much for watching. Thank you.